So in this final video, I'm going to discuss Kant's notion of the categorical imperative, which is essentially a kind of theoretical summation of his position. So in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, in chapter 2, he discusses the notion of an imperative. And he distinguishes in this between a hypothetical imperative and a categorical imperative. And we'll see in a moment what that distinction is. So he says, I'm going to read from the text. Everything in nature works in accordance with laws. Only a rational being has the power to act in accordance with his idea of laws, that is, in accordance with principles, and only so as he has a will. Since reason is required in order to derive actions from laws, the will is nothing but practical reason. If reason infallibly determines the will, then in a kind of being of this kind, the actions which are recognized to be objectively necessary are also subjectively necessary. That is to say, the will is then a power to choose only that which reason, independently of inclination, recognizes to be practically necessary, that is, to be good. So what Kant is doing here is he's essentially saying, he's establishing the Enlightenment view that everything operates in accordance with laws. So nature operates in accordance with laws, society operates in accordance with laws, and human beings act in accordance with laws. But what distinguishes human beings from nature is the element of freedom to act in accordance with a universal law, and that freedom is expressed in the notion of the will. And so practical reason for Kant is nothing but the subjective, rational decision to act in accordance with a universal law that one recognizes as necessary, as something that one must do. So I'm going to skip a little bit here. I'm not going to read the whole chapter because it's quite long. Kant says the conception of an objective principle so far as this principle is necessitating for a will is called a command of reason, and the formula of this command is called an imperative. So for Kant, rational ethical principles, moral principles, are called imperatives, and they're always formulated in the form of you must do this. And the idea that Kant is going to express is that an imperative is always universal. It's never going to have exceptions. If one establishes an imperative, there's never an exception under which that imperative would not be the case. So an imperative is not going to take into account the specific circumstances in which the imperative operates, at least a categorical imperative. So Kant says all imperatives are expressed by an ought. You ought to do this. By this they mark the relation of an objective law of reason to a will, which is not necessarily determined by this law in virtue of its subjective constitution. So an objective law of reason, not necessarily determined by this law in virtue of its subjective constitution. Now what Kant is going to say, the subjective constitution, he thinks that what makes a person, each person has reason, and reason is the ability to group a particular set of instances under a kind of universal category or law, and that he calls this, in the Critique of Pure Reason, he calls this the judgment. Judgment is being able to say X, Y, and Z all come under the category A, whereas M and N and O all don't come under the category of A. It's the ability to distinguish things. And so the imperative is objective, but it is up to an individual person to decide whether such and such a particular instant corresponds to that imperative. In other words, is such and such an act permissible under the universal law, under the objective necessity of the law. So Kant explains this here. He says they say that something would be good to do or to leave undone, only they say it to a will which does not always do a thing because it has been informed that this is a good thing to do. The practically good is that which determines the will by concepts of reason, and therefore not by subjective causes, but objectively, that is, on the ground valid for every rational being as such. It is distinguished from the pleasant as that which influences the will, not as a principle of reason valid for everyone, but solely through the medium of sensation by pure subjective causes valid only for the senses of this or that person. So what Kant is saying here is that, and it may be counterintuitive on some level, something is practically good when the action is determined on the basis of rational principles without any considerations of individual pleasure or general social good. None of that's important. Kant says all that matters is whether or not it's rational. So Kant says a perfectly good will would thus stand quite as much under objective laws, but it could not on this account be conceived as necessitated to act in conformity with law, since of itself, in accordance with its subjective constitution, it can be determined only by the concept of the good. So I'm going to move along then. So, okay, what I want to emphasize here now, Kant distinguishes here between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. Now, I'll read you what he says. All imperatives command either hypothetically or categorically. Hypothetical imperatives declare a possible action to be practically necessary as a means to the attainment of something else that one wills. So a hypothetical imperative is not what Kant is talking about here. He's actually against this notion in the sense of it being a basis for morality, of ethics. A hypothetical imperative is any principle that says, if you find yourself in such a situation, you should act in such a way. So, for example, if you find yourself under attack by a group of people, then it's okay to use violence in order to defend yourself. This would be hypothetical because the object here is the defense. You want to defend yourself. It's the ultimate goal. So violence is permissible in this particular case. So a hypothetical imperative takes into account the specificity of the circumstances in which the act is conducted. That's for many people, that is how we make decisions. We base our decisions whether or not they'll have a good outcome. But that categorical imperative, I'm going to read here, would be one which represented an action as objectively necessary in itself, apart from its relation to a further end. So Kant would say, a categorical imperative would say, you should never use reason, you should never use violence under any situation. So in that case, someone who has this pacifistic view would refuse to use violence to defend themselves, even if they're coming under attack. They'd probably accept death over life in this case, or at least not so much death, but would accept harm, being harmed by these other people, in order to maintain adherence to this categorical imperative, thou never shalt use violence, and it's a kind of way of formulating it. So that's a categorical imperative. It's that an action is objectively necessary, or rather objectively prohibited, independent of its further end. It doesn't take into account either the means or the end. It's independent of those things. Now, Kant is often called an idealist. In what sense is he called an idealist? He's called an idealist because for him, thought determines being. The simple structure of rational thinking is what determines one's being, what determines one's actions, what determines one's social constitution. This ideal kind of principle stands independent of any particular circumstances in which one finds oneself. So that's how it is idealist. Now, the 19th century philosopher Hegel often criticized Kant as being an abstract idealist because he sought the abstract universal. And what Hegel points out actually is that Kant's universality is entirely empty. It's essentially just a kind of empty, almost kind of bureaucratic principle that one adheres to, but it can't be universalized because it has no relationship to the concrete conditions in which people find themselves. And what in his philosophy Hegel will do, and later Marx will build on this, is to try to formulate a basis for universal morality that is nonetheless concretely related to the material constitution of human beings, that doesn't engage in this kind of Kantian abstractness that we find in Kant's writings. Okay, I just wanted to point that out. Now I'm going to go further. Every practical law represents a possible action as good and therefore as necessary for a subject whose actions are determined by reason. Hence, all imperatives are formula for determining an action which is necessary in accordance with the principle of will, in some sense good. If the action would be good solely as a means to something else, then the imperative is hypothetical. So if telling the truth, for example, is only good because it maintains the integrity of a community, or it prevents you from getting in trouble with the law, then it's just a hypothetical imperative. If you say you should tell the truth because otherwise people will, if you don't, people will think you're dishonest, that's hypothetical because it represents truth-telling as a means to integrity. If the action is represented as good in itself, and therefore as necessary, in virtue of the principle for a will, which of itself accords with reason, then the imperative is categorical. So good in itself meaning irrespective of any kind of means, ends. Furthermore, Kant says, a hypothetical imperative thus says only that an action is good for some purpose or other, either possible or actual. In the first case, it is a problematic practical principle. In the second case, an assertoric practical principle. A categorical imperative which declares an action to be objectively necessary in itself without further reference to some purpose ranks as an apodeictic practical principle. So what Kant is saying here, he's essentially saying that the issue he has with hypothetical imperatives is they can't be universalized, and therefore they can't be made the basis or the foundation for a rational morality. Because as he views it, reason only concerns itself with universals. Of course, a hypothetical imperative still essentially can say that in a particular set of circumstances you should always act in such a way. That is universalized. But Kant's going to say that these hypothetical imperatives always come up against certain limitations that prevent their universalization. And this is precisely why Kant is against this. Now, obviously, in everyday life, Kant probably also, like every human being, follows a whole set of hypothetical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives are how we create boundaries for ourselves and our community, how we create laws and rules. Hypothetical imperatives are the more or less common sense foundation for a lot of social structures. And I'm sure Kant participated in this as much as else. But all Kant wants to do is to say that as much as hypothetical imperatives are what we tend to find in everyday life and in the world, they can't serve as the basis for a universal morality. Okay, so I'm going to skip a little bit of this because Kant kind of repeats himself, as he often does, again and again. Well, he elaborates and says that here again opposes the notion of happiness. He doesn't like happiness as a basis for ethics. He says, unfortunately, the concept of happiness is so indeterminate a concept that although every man wants to attain happiness, He can never say definitively and in unison with himself what it really is that he wants and wills. The reason for this is that all the elements which belong to the concept of happiness are without exception empirical. That is, they must be borrowed from experience, but that nonetheless there is required for the idea of happiness an absolute whole, a maximum of well-being in my present and in every future state. Now, it is impossible for the most intelligent and at the same time most powerful, but nevertheless finite being, to form here a determinate concept of what he really wills. Is it riches that he wants? How much anxiety, envy, and pestering might he not bring in his way on his own head? Is it knowledge and insight? That might perhaps merely give him an eye so sharp that it would make evils at present hidden from him and yet unavoidable seem all the more frightful, and so forth and so on. So all Kant says is happiness is indeterminate. It's hard to define happiness because it can't be universalized, and it's based on what's empirical. And Kant, as a rationalist, is very much of the opinion that while the empirical can be used as material on which to deduce and engage in philosophical inquiry, it is only reason that can really give us access to universal postulates and principles. And when one starts to concern oneself with empirical matters, whether it's wealth or fame or knowledge, one wants to be kind of know-it-all and show off how much one knows, one is going to always find a certain kind of emptiness, a certain vanity, and Kant thinks this arises from the lack of a universal principle contained within it. Okay, so now I want to come to the close of this, and Kant then formulates here the notion of a categorical imperative. This is a very famous formulation. He says, there is therefore only a single categorical imperative, and it is this. This is the important passage. Act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And then he formulates it again. Act as if the maxim of your action were to become through your will a universal law of nature. So what Kant is saying here is that essentially, in the same way that a physicist or a biologist seeks universal laws of nature and organisms on the use of reason mediated by empirical research, Kant thinks we should seek ethical principles mediated through an analysis of human action. And those laws, we should only act in such a way that our action can be universalized. What Kant's going to say is, if your action cannot be considered rational in every particular situation, then you shouldn't do it, because then your action can't be law governed. You might still do it out of desire or necessity of circumstances, but Kant is going to say that you should act in such a way that when you act, it can be said that every person must act this way. You should never act in such a way that can't be generalized to every other group of people. Now, Kant gives here a few illustrations. He gives 4 of them. And in order to kind of close this discussion, I am going to look at each of them. Well, the first one, Kant says, a man feels sick of life as a result of a series of misfortunes that has mounted to the point of despair. But he's still so far in possession of his reason as to ask himself whether taking his own life may not be contrary to his duty to himself. There's someone who's miserable, who's lost everything. Maybe they're very ill, right? This obviously raises issues of euthanasia and assisted suicide. Can one take one's life, either with the help of chemicals, medicines, things like this, or simply killing oneself? Kant asks this question: can the maxim of my action really become a universal law of nature? So can it be the case that killing oneself, if one is miserable with life, be generalized to every single instance in which one might find oneself in that place? Kant says, His maxim is, from self-love, I make it my principle to shorten my life if its continuance threatens more evil than it promises pleasure. So this is what you're going to see in utilitarianism, is the idea that, well, ending my life will bring an end to all the pain and suffering, and hence continuing to live will bring about more evil. That's Kant's view here. And Kant says here, the only further question is to ask whether this principle of self-love can become a universal law of nature. It is then at once that a system of nature by whose law the very same feeling whose function is to stimulate the furtherance of life should actually destroy life would contradict itself and consequently could not subsist as a system of nature. Hence this maxim cannot possibly hold as a universal law of nature and is therefore entirely opposed to the supreme principle of duty. Now Kant here has an assumption, and if you want to criticize him, you should criticize the assumption. So in the time Kant was writing, the 18th century, and before Kant, the 17th century rationalists, all held to the view which is very much summed up in Spinoza's understanding of conatus. Conatus is the idea that everything strives to preserve itself. A body strives to continue in motion unless it's stopped by another body, and a human being, or any living being, for that matter, strives to preserve itself irrespective of the circumstances, and will only be unpreserved if something stops it, if something otherwise kills it. So that's Kant's idea here. And what he claims is that, well, if that's true, if everything strives to preserve itself, then it would be irrational not to do so. It would be irrational to kill yourself because your living organism strives to preserve itself. And so if I say, well, I'm not feeling so great, I'm going to go, find a euthanasia specialist and end it all, Kant would say that's not rational, because if you understand your organism and the laws of nature with which it's governed, then you know that it strives to preserve itself, even if it seems to be the case that it would bring about less evil to end one's life. And so that's Kant's essentially first line of reasoning, is it wouldn't be rational to do that. And furthermore, if all human beings committed suicide when they found themselves in difficult circumstances, there's many cases in which it probably wouldn't be rational to do so. For example, and here I can get behind Kant. Think of the periods in history where the masses of the people have lived under some form of dictatorship or fascist occupation that brought about great misery and suffering on the masses of people. Whether this is from racist oppression, such as existed in the United States in the period when you still had Jim Crow segregation, when millions of African Americans around the world lived in apartheid and segregation and faced regular terrorist attacks by white supremacists. In this situation, it's right to rebel, as some philosophers would have said in the past. It's right to rebel, and it makes no sense to just accept such a situation, and that indeed, this is the guiding principle that gave birth to the Civil Rights Movement and later the Black Liberation Movement, and continues today with the Black Lives Matter movement and the fight against police brutality in the United States and other parts of the world as well, where the tremendous suffering brought upon the masses of the people, although some may have had enough and unfortunately end their life, it is indeed the case that suicide rates often tend to be higher in impoverished communities and in communities of people who are face discrimination and oppression. There we find much higher suicide rates around the world. But for many people, there is more dignity in fighting and even in struggling for a better world, even if this results in more in suffering, in repression by the police, and imprisonment, many people are willing to put their lives on the line for a better world. Um, and so in some ways, what Kant is saying here is there's some truth to it. I think. I mean, I'm no Kantian, but I think what Kant is saying here is one can certainly find cases in which it wouldn't make sense to commit suicide just because life is difficult. Um, you know, eh, so Kant would then say, because you can find such a situation, you can't really generalize that. And then, as a result of this, you should never do it. You should never commit suicide. You should always maintain the fight to preserve one's life and stick to a certain ideal of a better world. And now, of course, the challenge is, of course, how do you generalize this? Because I think there are situations of people who are in tremendous pain because they have a terminal illness. Well, there are examples of Kantians in films and TV shows. What immediately comes to mind is Breaking Bad, one of the greatest TV shows ever created, where you have this character, Walt White, who is a high school physics teacher, and he has a terminal illness. He's going to die, and he's offered. He has all the ability to get the cancer treatment, but it's going to bring great suffering upon his family and himself, and he doesn't really want to undergo the cancer treatment. So he kind of, he goes and he becomes this in the show. He becomes gets involved in a kind of drug dealing kind of thing. But what's interesting about the show in this case is this is a case. Walt White specifically rejects euthanasia as an approach, and of course he also rejects self-preservation. He lives under some sense of illusion that he can continue to live, even if, even though he has a certain terminal illness that's going to kill himself, that's going to result in his death. He maintains a certain idealistic view that he's going to continue to live. Okay, I give the example of this so you can further think it through. But this, really, the point I'm making, this is the challenge with Kant here, is that because he doesn't take into account the circumstances, he would reject euthanasia under all circumstances, because you can find cases where it doesn't make sense to take the path to take that path. That's his approach. I'm going to skip the second one, which is about paying back a loan, and let's look at the fourth one here. Kant says, yet a fourth is himself flourishing, but he sees others who have to struggle with great hardships, and he thinks, what does it matter to me? Let everyone be as happy as heaven wills or as he can make it himself. I won't deprive him of anything. I won't envy him. Only I have no wish to contribute anything to his well-being or to support in his distress. Now, admittedly, if such an attitude were a universal law of nature, mankind could get on perfectly well. Better, no doubt, than if everybody parades himself on sympathy and goodwill, and even takes pain on occasion to practice them, but on the other hand, cheats where he can, traffics in human rights, or violates them in other ways. But although it is possible that a universal law of nature could subsist in harmony with this maxim, yet it is impossible to will that such a principle should hold everywhere as a law of nature. For a will which decided in this way would be in conflict with itself, since many a situation might arise in which the man needed love and sympathy for other, and which by such a law of nature, sprung from his own will, he would himself rob of all help, of the help he wants for himself. What Kant is saying here is, imagine a situation where someone is in need but is really not a good person and hasn't done you well. It could be a person who has seriously done you wrong, but you know something about them that could um, lead to their essentially you could you could get them in trouble, or you could get some kind of revenge on them. Kant says such considerations shouldn't be taken into account. Even a person who you hold in contempt, Kant says you should view them in the way you view everyone else, and treat them with some kind of respect. Um, okay, so I want to close here because I feel like it's getting somewhat redundant. But that is essentially Kant's ethics. Um, the main issue with it is, as you can see, it doesn't take into account the specificity of situations in which people find themselves in. It is a rationalist ethics founded in idealist principles, not based on anything concrete or material, but solely universal principles. The idea is you universalize a law, you apply it abstractly in very much the way that the state might apply a law to you. It doesn't make any exceptions. So some might say, well, Kant is very inflexible. And indeed he isn't. But I would say the main positive element of Kant is, in some sense, one could kind of envision a kind of revised Kantianism, where the inflexibility is related to a set of principles that one relies on, that one lives one's life by, that one isn't willing to bend on, but that could flexibly be, but where the specific situation one finds in, one could still be flexible. One could think strategically, tactically, but ultimately, what acts as a kind of categorical imperative is essentially a cause that one's living for, that one's willing to give everything for. That would be a kind of Kantian. I think if one applies Kant just as it is, then I don't think there's much value to Kant, because ultimately no one in actual practice will be a Kantian. There are a few people that really act this way, that say it's always wrong to tell a lie in any situation. For example, Kant says this, that results in the situation where Kant is unwilling to even lie to save his own life in the face of a murderer, and to protect the life of someone else who he's protecting from this murderer. Kant would say no. But if one revises it, and one puts the emphasis not on particular moral principles, such as you should never tell the truth, but a general principle governing everything that one is doing, a general end which one is kind of thinking towards, that all one's actions are kind of subordinated to. Whether, for example, this might be the postulate of liberation. What one is dedicated one's life to is the liberation of all peoples, of all of humanity. This could function as a categorical imperative, that one is willing to utilize different means, different particular campaigns, tactics, and so forth. The ultimate notion of liberation acts as a kind of categorical imperative that does govern everything one does, one's kind of vision, that one bases one's life on a vision for a certain future that may be totally in conflict with the existing state of things, but nonetheless, one still fights for it. It's essentially what the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek has called the politics of the impossible. One thinks of almost something very different from where we find ourselves today, a liberatory humanity where every form of oppression is ended, where all wars have come to an end, where people live together in collaboration rather than competition, and where the class structure that governs societies has come to an end. This kind of liberatory vision of humanity that has taken many different forms, that in ancient religious texts of Judaism was sometimes visioned in the notion of Moshiach, the notion of a Messiah, and a Messianic age where all wars have come to an end and all the rest of it, and people live together in peaceful humanity, where all the nations of the world live together, and which in modern times have come in the form of different socialist movements and people's liberation movements that envision more or less the same thing, but in a more kind of concrete material sense. This notion of a liberated humanity can function as a categorical imperative, because it has exactly here the notion that Kant stated in the book, which I read. I will read it one last time. Act as if the maxim of your action were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature. And this notion of what one does, a person who is guided by such a vision of humanity, a liberated future. To take one final example, the great Ukrainian Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky, who I greatly admire, was indeed, in this sense, very much a Kantian. Who was Trotsky? Well, Trotsky was a Russian revolutionary leader who dedicated his life to bringing an end to Tsarism in Russia, which brought tremendous suffering upon the masses of the working people and the oppressed people of the Russian Empire. But furthermore, wanted to see an international socialist world, not simply a socialist Russia, where Russia would build socialism, but an international socialist world that would put an end to classes and that would put an end to racism and war and imperialism and all the other negative things that hurt our society. Everything Trotsky did in his life was governed by this particular vision. He acted in such a way that every single act could be ultimately subordinated to this, not so much final goal, but final vision. And he paid for it with his life. In 1940, Trotsky was living in exile in Mexico. He had been exiled since 1929 from the Soviet Union by the Stalinist police, who viewed him as a danger and a dangerous force because he was willing to heroically criticize the bureaucratic direction that the Soviet Union had gone on. He first spent some time in exile in Turkey and then in France, and then finally the Mexican government gave him asylum, and that's where he spent the last few years of his life and where he wrote some of his greatest masterpieces. And some of Trotsky's followers, who were around an organization called the Fourth International, continued this kind of vision of a liberated humanity. And Trotsky paid for this with his life in 1940, when he was assassinated by some of his enemies from the Stalinist bureaucracy. And what's interesting about Trotsky is he knew that his life was in danger, but he continued to write, very much like other revolutionary figures, such as Patrice Lumumba, the first president of liberated Congo, Che Guevara, who could have continued to live a very stable life in independent Cuba, but instead left Cuba to go join the liberation struggles around the world, and who died for it. Martin Luther King, who was assassinated for his anti-racist views, and not just his anti-racist views, but for his opposition to the Vietnam War and his criticism of U.S. imperialism. Many other such individuals. I give these examples. All of these people could be grouped in the kind of Kantian direction because their approach to life was one of acting, organizing, and thinking everything that they did under the governance of a kind of greater cause to which they subordinated themselves. And all of them were viewed in some way by people as inflexible at times. That people often denounce Trotsky as very inflexible, as unwilling to bend from his principles, and the same has been said about many. But this inflexibility, in some ways, is actually the expression of a great flexibility in tactics. All of these figures of history were willing to use tactics of varying kinds. What they were inflexible about was the ultimate end goal, which, by the way, didn't function as a hypothetical imperative. None of them argued that you should, use mass strikes or civil disobedience to achieve the goal. These were simply tactics to enact a particular strategic political line that they had developed. But the ultimate goal, wow, that was something that many of them often didn't say this or that tactic should be used to achieve that goal. That goal may have been in the far future, but that goal was ultimately the universal maxim governing their particular action. Okay, so I give these examples in order to show how maybe Kant, we could think of how Kant could be relevant on some level. That Kant wasn't just this philosopher who wasn't willing to bend his principles under any circumstances, that there is some way we can appreciate Kant, regardless of what you think about it. You may disagree with this. You may not. You may think such individuals who act this way or live this way are not so commendable, but you don't like this kind of thing. That you'd approach a more kind of centrist approach, where you're willing to take a kind of level-headed, maybe let's see how we can improve this situation. Let's not think in terms of grand narratives. This is very much the kind of postmodern ideology that's in dominance today. Is this centrist approach, which says let's try to think about how we can address the particular housing crisis, or let's think how we can address poverty, but not under the guidance of any kind of long-term liberated vision of humanity, but rather an immediate goal, which is getting people housing, getting rid of poverty, which are both great things in the very important campaigns, but which sometimes are self-defeating because they, by not having a long-term vision, they often lose sight of the, in my opinion, bigger kind of picture and interconnections between these different particular individual kind of campaigns. Okay, so that's kind of the end of this critique. Okay, so that is the end of Kant. I don't think there's much more to say about Kant. There is a third chapter in the book where he talks about freedom, but I personally don't think it's as relevant as the preface in the first two chapters. Okay, that's the end of this video.